Marcus Thompson stood at attention outside the gates of Buckingham Palace, his red uniform perfectly pressed, his black bearskin hat sitting straight on his head. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard as tourists gathered behind the metal barriers, cameras clicking constantly. To them, he was just another silent statue in a fancy costume, a piece of living decoration they could pose next to for their holiday photos. The 26-year-old guard had been standing in this exact spot for 3 hours without moving a muscle. His feet ached in the heavy black boots. Sweat trickled down his back under the thick woolen tunic, but his face remained expressionless. This was his job, his duty, and he took it seriously even when others didn't. "Look at him just standing there like a robot," laughed a teenage boy from behind the barrier. His friends joined in, making jokes about how the guards were probably hollow inside, just empty uniforms with no real people in them. Marcus had heard it all before. The tourists always thought the guards couldn't hear them. Or maybe they just didn't care. A group of young men in expensive suits approached the barrier, clearly having enjoyed a long lunch at one of London's finest restaurants. Their voices carried the confidence that came with privilege and too much wine. The tallest one, with perfectly styled blonde hair and a smirk that never left his face, pointed directly at Marcus. "I bet he can't even fight," the man said loudly to his companions. "Probably never held a real weapon in his life. Just plays dress-up for the tourists." His friends erupted in laughter, encouraging him to continue. "These palace guards are just for show, mate. Completely useless. I could probably take him down with one hand tied behind my back." Marcus's jaw tightened slightly, but he maintained his position. He had trained for moments like this. The Queen's Guard were taught to ignore insults, to remain professional no matter what. But something about this particular group bothered him more than usual. Maybe it was their arrogant assumption that he was weak, or perhaps it was the way they spoke about his service as if it meant nothing. The blond man wasn't finished. He stepped closer to the barrier, his voice getting louder and more obnoxious. "I wonder if he even knows how to use that rifle properly. Probably just a toy gun filled with blanks. These ceremonial soldiers wouldn't last 5 minutes in a real fight." What the tourists didn't know, what they could never guess from looking at Marcus's stoic face, was that before joining the Queen's Guard, he had served 3 tours of duty in Afghanistan with the parachute regiment. He had crawled through Taliban-controlled valleys, engaged in firefights that lasted for hours, and saved the lives of fellow soldiers under heavy enemy fire. The rifle he carried wasn't just for show. It was a fully functional SA-80 assault rifle, and he could field strip and reassemble it blindfolded in under 2 minutes. But Marcus said nothing. He revealed nothing. He simply stood there, allowing the mockery to wash over him like rain off his red tunic. This was part of the job, part of the sacrifice he made to serve his country in this new capacity. The Queen's Guard were expected to be living symbols of British tradition and strength, not to engage in petty arguments with disrespectful tourists. The group of men continued their taunts for another 10 minutes before growing bored and wandering off toward Westminster Bridge. Marcus remained perfectly still, counting down the minutes until his shift changed. In 30 more minutes, another guard would come to relieve him and he could finally move, finally stretch his aching muscles. As the afternoon wore on, more tourists came and went. Most were respectful, taking their photos from a reasonable distance and speaking in hushed, awed tones about the tradition they were witnessing. But there were always a few who pushed boundaries, who seemed to think that because the guards couldn't respond, they were fair game for any kind of abuse. An elderly American couple approached with their granddaughter, a girl of about 8 years old. The little girl stared up at Marcus with wide, wondering eyes. "Grandpa," she whispered, "is he real?" Her grandfather chuckled softly. "Yes, sweetheart. He's a real soldier, protecting the Queen and her palace. He's very brave and very dedicated to his job." The little girl continued to stare, then suddenly saluted Marcus with her tiny hand. It was such a pure, innocent gesture of respect that Marcus felt his heart warm slightly. These were the moments that made the difficult parts of his job worthwhile, when people, especially children, understood that what he did mattered. As his shift neared its end, Marcus reflected on the day's events. The insults from the group of privileged young men still stung, but he had handled them professionally. He had maintained the dignity of his position and the honor of his regiment. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tourists, and probably new insults. What Marcus didn't know was that his encounter with the arrogant group was far from over. The blond man who had mocked him so cruelly was named Charles Pemberton III, son of a wealthy businessman and member of Parliament. Charles had a habit of getting what he wanted through his family's money and influence, and he had a particular dislike for what he saw as working-class soldiers playing at being important. In 3 days' time, their paths would cross again under very different circumstances. The quiet, mocked royal guard would have the opportunity to prove that his training was very real. His skills were very sharp, and his dedication to protecting others ran deeper than any uniform or ceremony. The rifle he carried wasn't just for show, and neither was the man who carried it. But for now, Marcus simply waited for his relief to arrive, standing silent and strong in the fading afternoon light, a guardian whose true worth had yet to be revealed. 3 days later, Marcus was enjoying his first day off in 2 weeks. He had traded his red uniform for civilian clothes, dark jeans, a simple gray sweater, and comfortable walking shoes. Without his ceremonial dress, he looked like any other young man wandering through London's busy streets. The weight of his bearskin hat was gone, replaced by the freedom to move his head naturally and observe the world around him, without the rigid discipline of palace duty. He had decided to spend his afternoon at the Imperial War Museum, a place where he could remember his fallen comrades and reflect on his military service in peaceful silence. The museum held special meaning for him. It honored all those who had served, from the trenches of World War I to the mountains of Afghanistan where he had fought just 2 years earlier. As Marcus walked through the Afghanistan exhibition, studying photographs and artifacts from the conflict he knew so intimately, he noticed familiar voices echoing from the next room. The arrogant laughter was unmistakable. It was the same group that had mocked him at Buckingham Palace 3 days ago. Charles Pemberton III was holding court in the World War II section, entertaining his friends with loud observations about military history. These old wars were different, he declared, gesturing at a display about the Battle of Britain. Men were tougher then, not like today's soldiers who need therapy for everything. Modern military is just a social experiment gone wrong. His friends nodded along, encouraging his increasingly offensive commentary. Marcus moved closer, staying behind a large display case where he could observe without being seen. He wanted to understand what kind of person found entertainment in disrespecting those who served their country. Take Afghanistan, for example, Charles continued, his voice dripping with disdain. We spent billions training soldiers to fight farmers with old rifles. Most of our troops probably never even fired their weapons, just sat in safe compounds playing video games and collecting paychecks. Marcus felt his hands clench into fists. He had lost 3 close friends in Afghanistan. Tommy Harrison, killed by an improvised explosive device while on patrol. Sarah Mitchell, shot by a sniper while providing medical aid to wounded civilians. David Chen, killed in action during a firefight that lasted 14 hours. None of them had been playing video games or hiding in safe compounds. But Marcus controlled his anger. This wasn't the time or place for confrontation. He was off duty, trying to enjoy a peaceful afternoon, and getting into arguments with ignorant civilians wouldn't honor his fallen friend's memory. Charles wasn't finished with his performance. He moved to a display about modern military equipment, pointing at a photograph of British soldiers in combat gear. Look at all this expensive equipment they need just to feel safe. Body armor, night vision, communication devices. In the old days, soldiers fought with rifles and courage. Now they're too scared to move without a satellite tracking their every step. One of his friends, a shorter man with thinning hair, joined in the mockery. Remember that palace guard we saw the other day? Perfect example of modern military weakness. Standing there like a mannequin, probably doesn't even know which end of the rifle to hold. The group erupted in laughter, recreating their mockery of Marcus's stoic pose. They took turns imitating what they thought was a soldier's stance, making exaggerated faces and pretending to hold rifles like children playing war games. Marcus had heard enough. He was about to leave the museum when something unexpected happened that would change everything. As the group continued their loud performance, drawing annoyed looks from other visitors, the museum's security alarm suddenly began blaring throughout the building. A voice crackled over the intercom system. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not a drill. The museum is now in lockdown due to a security threat. Please remain calm and follow the instructions of museum staff. Do not attempt to leave the building. The laughter stopped immediately. Charles and his friends looked around nervously as museum security guards began moving through the halls. directing visitors to designated safe areas. The casual afternoon had suddenly become something much more serious. Marcus's military training kicked in automatically. While other visitors stood around looking confused and frightened, he began assessing the situation. He noted the security guards' positions, identified potential exit routes, and observed the behavior of everyone around him. Years of combat experience had taught him to read danger signs that others might miss. Through a window, he could see police cars arriving outside the museum, their blue lights flashing. Armed officers were taking positions around the building's perimeter. This wasn't a simple fire drill or false alarm. Something significant was happening. A security guard approached their section of the museum, speaking in calm but urgent tones. "Everyone needs to move to the main hall immediately. Stay together, stay quiet, and follow my lead. We have a situation that requires everyone to be in a secure location." As the group began moving, Marcus noticed that Charles and his friends had lost all their earlier bravado. Their faces were pale with genuine fear, and they huddled together like schoolchildren. The same man who had mocked soldiers for being weak was now trembling as he followed basic safety instructions. In the main hall, hundreds of visitors were gathered together, all looking toward the museum staff for information and guidance. Museum Director Elizabeth Hayes stepped forward with a microphone, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have received a credible threat against this museum. Armed individuals are believed to be attempting to enter the building. The police are handling the situation, but for your safety we must remain in lockdown until they give us the all clear. Please stay calm and stay together." The crowd's murmur grew louder as fear spread through the hall. Parents pulled their children closer. Elderly visitors sat down on benches looking worried and confused. Tour groups clustered around their guides seeking reassurance. Marcus found himself thinking about the security weaknesses he had already identified in the building. The museum was large and complex, with multiple levels and numerous potential entry points. If armed individuals were determined to get inside, they would likely find a way. The question was what their intentions were once they succeeded. He looked around at the frightened civilians surrounding him, families with young children, elderly couples, school groups, international tourists who were far from home. These people had come to learn about history and honor those who had served. They didn't deserve to become victims of whatever was happening outside. As if responding to his thoughts, the lights in the main hall suddenly went out. Emergency lighting flickered on, casting eerie shadows across the main hall as panicked voices rose from the crowd. Children began crying, and several elderly visitors called out in confusion and fear. The professional calm that museum staff had maintained just moments before began to crack under the pressure of the deteriorating situation. Marcus remained perfectly still in the dim light, his senses heightened and alert. The sudden power outage wasn't random, it was tactical. Someone had deliberately cut the electricity to create confusion and disable security systems. This was the beginning of a coordinated attack, not a simple threat that could be resolved by police negotiation. Through the tall windows, he could see muzzle flashes in the darkness outside. The armed police who had surrounded the building were engaged in active combat with unknown assailants. The sharp crack of gunfire echoed across the museum grounds, causing several visitors to scream and drop to the floor. Museum security guards tried to maintain order, but they were clearly overwhelmed by the rapidly escalating situation. These were professionals trained to handle unruly tourists and minor disturbances, not armed terrorists attempting to breach a major London landmark. Their radios crackled with urgent communications from police outside, but the messages were fragmented and difficult to understand. Charles Pemberton and his friends had pressed themselves against a wall near the World War II display, their earlier arrogance completely replaced by genuine terror. The same man who had mocked soldiers for being weak was now hyperventilating, his expensive suit wrinkled and sweat-stained. His friends weren't faring much better. Their privileged upbringing hadn't prepared them for real danger. "What do we do?" Charles whispered to his companions, his voice shaking. "Are they coming inside? Should we hide? Should we run?" None of his friends had answers. They were civilians who had lived comfortable, protected lives. The closest they had come to violence was watching action movies or playing video games. Now they faced the real possibility of armed attackers entering the museum, and they had no idea how to respond. Marcus, meanwhile, was conducting his own tactical assessment. The main hall was a large open space with limited cover and multiple access points. If attackers gained entry, the hundreds of trapped visitors would be completely vulnerable. The museum's layout worked against them. Long corridors and open galleries that offered no protection from gunfire. The emergency lighting revealed something that made Marcus's blood run cold. Near the museum's main entrance, he could see armed figures moving in the shadows. They had breached the building's perimeter and were now inside. The police barricade outside had been overcome or bypassed. Museum Director Elizabeth Hayes tried to use her microphone to calm the crowd, but her voice was drowned out by the growing panic. Visitors were beginning to scatter, some running toward the exits despite staff instructions to stay together. Others huddled behind display cases, hoping the artifacts would provide protection from whatever was coming. Through the chaos, Marcus heard something that made his blood freeze. The distinctive sound of military-grade assault rifles being chambered. These weren't ordinary criminals or desperate individuals acting alone. The weapons were professional, the tactics were coordinated, and the attackers were moving with the precision of trained soldiers. A new voice suddenly echoed through the museum's public address system. It wasn't museum staff or police. It was one of the attackers who had somehow gained access to the communication equipment. "Ladies and gentlemen," the voice said with chilling calm, "you are now hostages of the People's Liberation Front. We have taken control of this building and neutralized the police presence outside. You will remain exactly where you are while we complete our mission. Anyone who attempts to flee or interfere will be shot." The voice continued with practiced efficiency. "We are not here to harm innocent civilians. Our target is symbolic. This museum represents everything wrong with British imperialism and military aggression. We intend to destroy the exhibits that glorify war and violence, starting with the Afghanistan display." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the emergency lighting. The Afghanistan exhibit contained personal items donated by families of fallen soldiers, photographs, letters, medals awarded posthumously. Destroying those artifacts would be like desecrating graves, erasing the memory of men and women who had died serving their country. But more importantly, the attackers were moving through the museum systematically, which meant they would eventually reach the main hall where hundreds of innocent people were trapped. Despite their claims about not harming civilians, Marcus knew that cornered terrorists often became unpredictable and violent. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the corridor leading to the main hall. Heavy boots moving in formation, getting closer with each passing second. Museum security guards looked helplessly at their basic equipment, radios, flashlights, and pepper spray that would be useless against military weapons. Marcus made a decision that would change everything. While other visitors cowered in fear and security guards felt overwhelmed by the situation, he began moving quietly through the crowd toward the museum's administrative offices. He remembered seeing a sign earlier indicating that building maintenance and security systems were controlled from that area. If the attackers had cut main power to create confusion, there might be backup systems that could be reactivated. More importantly, the administrative area might contain communication, equipment that could reach police outside, or security cameras that could reveal the attackers' positions and numbers. As he moved through the frightened crowd, Marcus passed close to where Charles and his friends were huddled against the wall. The arrogant young man who had mocked palace guards and questioned soldiers' courage was now shaking with terror, completely helpless in the face of real danger. Their eyes met for just a moment in the dim emergency lighting. Charles didn't recognize the quiet civilian in ordinary clothes as the royal guard he had humiliated 3 days earlier, but Marcus recognized him perfectly. The privileged bully who thought military service was a joke and soldiers were weaklings playing dress-up. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on Marcus. The same man who had questioned whether palace guards could use their rifles properly was about to discover exactly what kind of training and courage lay beneath that ceremonial red uniform. But first, Marcus had work to do. The footsteps in the corridor were getting louder. Marcus slipped away from the main hall while the crowd's attention was focused on the approaching sounds of the attackers. Using skills learned during night operations in Afghanistan, he moved silently through the museum's darkened corridors, avoiding the emergency lights that would make him visible to anyone watching. The administrative area was located on the second floor, accessible through a service stairwell that most visitors never noticed. Marcus climbed the stairs carefully, testing each step to avoid creaking sounds that might alert the attackers to his movement. His civilian clothes were actually an advantage now. He looked like a lost tourist rather than a potential threat. The security office door was locked, but Marcus had learned basic lockpicking techniques during special operations training. Within 2 minutes, he had gained access to the room containing the museum's communication and surveillance equipment. Banks of monitors showed camera feeds from throughout the building, revealing the full scope of what they were facing. 6 armed attackers had entered the museum through different access points. They moved with military precision, wearing tactical gear and carrying assault rifles that Marcus recognized as high-end weapons, not easily obtained by ordinary criminals. These weren't desperate amateurs. They were well-trained, well-equipped, and following a carefully planned operation. The leader appeared to be a tall man with a distinctive scar across his left cheek. Communicating with his team through professional-grade headsets, Marcus watched as they systematically moved through the museum, placing explosive charges near key exhibits while herding any remaining visitors toward the main hall. But the camera feeds revealed something else that changed everything. In the basement level, Marcus spotted 2 museum security guards who had been shot and were lying motionless near the building's main electrical controls. The attackers hadn't just cut power. They had killed anyone who might have been able to restore it. This wasn't a symbolic protest or political demonstration. These were experienced killers who had already shown they were willing to murder innocent people to accomplish their goals. Their claims about not harming civilians were lies designed to keep the hostages calm while they completed their mission. Marcus examined the security office's communication equipment and discovered that the attackers had jammed most radio frequencies, cutting off contact with police outside. However, there was an older emergency communication system that operated on a different frequency, one that might still be functional. He activated the backup system and managed to establish contact with a police commander outside the building. Speaking quietly into the headset, Marcus provided crucial intelligence about the attackers' positions, weapons, and apparent objectives. "This is Sergeant Marcus Thompson, Parachute Regiment currently inside the museum," he whispered into the microphone. 6 hostile attackers, military-trained, armed with assault rifles and explosives. They've killed at least 2 security personnel and are holding approximately 400 civilians hostage in the main hall. The police commander's voice crackled back through static. "Sergeant Thompson, this is Commander Richards, SO-19 armed response. Can you confirm your identity and current position?" Marcus provided his service number and current location, then continued his report. Attackers appeared to be placing charges throughout the building, possibly planning to destroy the museum with hostages inside. They're moving systematically toward the main hall. Estimate 15 minutes before they reach the civilian population. Understood, Sergeant. We have tactical teams positioned around the perimeter, but we can't risk an assault with so many hostages at risk. Can you provide ongoing intelligence on their movements? Marcus studied the monitor screens, tracking each attacker's position through the museum's corridor system. Affirmative, Commander. I have visual on all 6 hostiles through security cameras. But there's something else you need to know. They're not just here to make a political statement. These are professional killers, and I don't think they plan to leave witnesses. Through the cameras, Marcus watched as the attackers continued their methodical progress through the museum. They weren't rushing or showing signs of panic. They moved like soldiers following a mission timeline. Most disturbing of all, they were placing more explosive charges than would be necessary to simply destroy exhibits. The amount of explosive material they were installing suggested they intended to level the entire building, killing everyone inside in the process. This was a suicide mission disguised as a hostage situation, designed to create maximum casualties and media impact. Marcus continued monitoring the screens while maintaining radio contact with police outside. He provided real-time updates on the attackers' positions, allowing the tactical teams to understand their movement patterns and plan potential intervention points. But as he watched, something on the monitors made his heart race. The lead attacker with the scarred face had stopped in front of a museum map and was pointing toward the main hall while speaking into his headset. The other attackers immediately changed direction, abandoning their systematic placement of charges to converge on the location where hundreds of innocent people were trapped. "Commander Richards?" Marcus whispered urgently into the radio. "All hostiles are now moving toward the main hall. They've accelerated their timeline. You have maybe 5 minutes before they reach the civilian population. The police commander's response was grim. Our tactical teams can't breach the building in 5 minutes without risking massive civilian casualties. The angles are all wrong and we don't have clear shots on the hostiles. Marcus understood what the commander wasn't saying directly. The police were prepared to storm the building if necessary, but with 6 well-armed attackers in close proximity to 400 hostages, any rescue attempt would likely result in a massacre. They needed someone inside the building to either stop the attackers or create an opportunity for tactical teams to intervene safely. Looking at the weapons locker in the security office, Marcus found exactly what he had hoped for, but wasn't sure would be available. The museum maintained 2 hunting rifles for use by security personnel in extreme emergencies. Basic but functional weapons that could be effective in trained hands. Marcus checked the rifles carefully, confirming they were properly maintained and loaded. They weren't military-grade assault weapons like the attackers carried, but they would have to be sufficient. He had successfully engaged enemy fighters with less sophisticated equipment during his tours in Afghanistan. Through the monitor screens, he could see that the lead attacker had reached the corridor leading to the main hall. In the dim emergency lighting, Marcus could make out the man's face clearly for the first time. The scar across his left cheek was distinctive, but it was his cold, calculating expression that revealed his true intentions. This man had no plan to negotiate with police or make political demands. He was here to kill as many people as possible before dying himself. The People's Liberation Front was probably a fictional organization created to provide cover for what was essentially a mass murder plot. Marcus slung one of the rifles across his shoulder and picked up additional ammunition. He had perhaps 3 minutes before the attackers reached the main. All were Charles Pemberton and hundreds of other innocent people were waiting helplessly for rescue that might never come. The quiet royal guard who had been mocked for standing motionless was about to prove that his training, his courage, and his dedication to protecting others were very real indeed. Marcus moved through the museum's darkened corridors with the silent precision that had kept him alive during 3 combat tours in Afghanistan. The hunting rifle felt familiar in his hands despite being different from his standard military weapon. Years of training had taught him to adapt quickly to any available equipment. Through his radio earpiece, he could hear Commander Richards coordinating with tactical teams outside. All units, Sergeant Thompson is our only asset inside the building. He's moving to intercept the hostiles before they reach the civilian population. Do not engage unless you have clear shots that won't endanger our inside man. The weight of responsibility settled on Marcus's shoulders. 400 innocent lives depended on his ability to stop 6 heavily armed attackers using basic equipment and the element of surprise. The odds were overwhelming, but he had faced impossible situations before and survived through careful planning and decisive action. Using the museum's layout to his advantage, Marcus positioned himself in the Egyptian Artifacts Gallery, which overlooked the main corridor leading to the hall where the hostages waited. The elevated position would give him clear sightlines on the approaching attackers while providing cover behind ancient stone sarcophagi. Through the security camera feeds displayed on his portable radio device, Marcus watched as the 6 attackers moved in tactical formation toward their target. The leader with the scarred face was in front, followed by 2 men covering the flanks with 3 more bringing up the rear. They moved like experienced soldiers, checking corners and maintaining communication through their headsets. Marcus's radio crackled softly. Sergeant Thompson, hostile team has reached the junction 50 meters from your position. They're moving in standard military formation. Be advised, thermal imaging suggests they may have grenades in addition to assault rifles. The confirmation of grenades changed Marcus's tactical approach completely. If the attackers reached the main hall with explosive devices, they could kill dozens of hostages instantly before any rescue attempt could be mounted. He had to stop them here, in the narrow corridors where their superior numbers and firepower would be less effective. Taking position behind a massive stone statue of Pharaoh Ramesses II, Marcus steadied his rifle and controlled his breathing. The first attacker appeared at the end of the corridor, assault rifle raised and scanning for threats. Marcus could see the man's face clearly in his rifle scope, young, determined, and completely focused on reaching the hostages. The shot had to be perfect. Miss, and the attackers would know they were being engaged by someone inside the building. They might decide to accelerate their timeline and rush the main hall, making rescue impossible. Marcus had one chance to begin evening the odds. He squeezed the trigger smoothly, the way he had been taught in basic training and perfected through years of combat experience. The rifle cracked sharply in the confined space and the lead attacker dropped instantly. The man's assault rifle clattered across the marble floor as his teammates immediately took cover and began scanning for the source of the shot. "Contact," one of the attackers shouted into his radio. "Davies is down! We have a hostile shooter somewhere in the museum. Unknown position, single shot, professional accuracy." Marcus was already moving to a new position before the echo of his shot had faded. Standing still after firing was a guaranteed way to die in combat. He relocated to behind a display case containing medieval armor, maintaining visual contact with the corridor while staying concealed from return fire. The remaining 5 attackers had spread out and were advancing more cautiously now, knowing they faced an armed opponent inside the building. Their leader's voice carried clearly through the museum's acoustics as he coordinated their response. Thompson took Davies out with a single shot from elevated position, marksman-level accuracy. Could be police sniper who got inside somehow. Watch the upper galleries and maintain formation. We stick to the mission timeline. Marcus realized they had identified him by name, which meant they either had inside information about police operations or sophisticated surveillance equipment. Either way, they knew he was former military and would adjust their tactics accordingly. The element of surprise was diminishing rapidly. Through his radio, Commander Richards provided an update that made the situation even more urgent. "Sergeant Thompson, we've identified the attackers through facial recognition. They're former military personnel from several different countries, suspected of working as mercenaries. These aren't political extremists, they're professional killers hired to carry out this attack." The revelation that these were mercenaries rather than ideological terrorists confirmed Marcus's assessment that this was a suicide mission, designed to maximize casualties. Someone had paid these men to kill as many people as possible and destroy the museum in the process. They wouldn't be deterred by negotiation or the threat of capture. Marcus watched through his scope as the attackers adapted their approach, using tactical movements he recognized from his own training. They were good, better than the Taliban fighters he had faced in Afghanistan. But they were operating in an environment they hadn't prepared for, while Marcus had spent the last hour studying the museum's layout and planning his defensive strategy. The second shot came as one of the attackers exposed himself while trying to advance along the left wall. Marcus's bullet took him center mass, dropping him immediately. The man's assault rifle skittered across the floor, coming to rest near a display of Roman shields that seemed grimly appropriate. "Contact left," the remaining attackers shouted, finally identifying Marcus's general position. Automatic weapons fire erupted in the gallery, bullets striking ancient artifacts and shattering display cases around him. Priceless historical treasures that had survived thousands of years were being destroyed in seconds. Marcus rolled behind a thick marble column as bullets chipped away chunks of stone around him. The attackers were laying down suppressing fire while repositioning to flank his position. With their superior firepower and numbers, they could pin him down and maneuver around him if he remained static. But Marcus had an advantage they didn't expect. While they saw the museum as an unfamiliar maze of corridors and galleries, he had spent his afternoon studying every room and exhibit. He knew exactly how to move through the building without being seen. Crawling through a maintenance access door hidden behind a World War I trench exhibit, Marcus emerged in the weapons collection gallery directly above the attacker's position. Through the floor's glass panels designed to display artifacts below, he could see 3 of the remaining 4 men advancing toward his previous position. The 4th attacker had disappeared, which meant he was either flanking through a parallel corridor or had continued toward the main hall to complete the mission while his teammates engaged the threat. Marcus had to assume the worst-case scenario, that one attacker was still moving toward the hostages while 3 others tried to eliminate him. His radio crackled with an urgent update from Commander Richards. Thermal imaging shows one hostile has broken off from the main group and is approaching the civilian area. You've got maybe 90 seconds before he reaches the main hall. Marcus made a split-second decision that went against every instinct of self-preservation. Instead of continuing to engage the 3 attackers below him, he had to abandon his defensive position and race to intercept the lone attacker heading for the hostages. It meant exposing himself to enemy fire and giving up his tactical advantage, but 400 innocent lives were more important than his personal safety. He sprinted through the weapons gallery toward the emergency stairwell, the sound of his footsteps echoing off the walls despite his efforts to move quietly. Behind him, he could hear the remaining attackers realizing he was relocating and beginning their pursuit. The race to save the hostages had begun. Marcus reached the emergency stairwell and descended 3 steps at a time, his rifle ready but pointed safely downward as he moved. Every second counted now. The lone attacker had a significant head start toward the main hall where hundreds of innocent people waited in terror. As he reached the ground floor, Marcus could hear panicked voices coming from the main hall. Museum staff were trying to keep people calm. But word had spread that gunfire was echoing through the building. Children were crying. Elderly visitors were struggling to understand what was happening, and everyone was pressed together in the dim emergency lighting, making them perfect targets for anyone with explosive devices. Marcus emerged from the stairwell into the corridor leading to the main hall, just as the 4th attacker appeared at the opposite end. The man was moving quickly but carefully, assault rifle raised and a bandolier of grenades clearly visible across his chest. When he saw Marcus, both men froze for a split second, each recognizing the immediate threat the other represented. The attacker reacted first, raising his weapon and firing a burst of automatic gunfire down the corridor. Marcus dove sideways behind a thick stone pillar as bullets shattered the wall where he had been standing just moments before. Marble dust filled the air and the sound of gunfire sent screams echoing from the main hall. From his position behind the pillar, Marcus could hear the attacker's footsteps approaching rapidly. The man was advancing while firing controlled bursts, using professional tactics to suppress any return fire while closing the distance. Marcus knew he had perhaps 10 seconds before the attacker would be close enough to use grenades effectively. Through his radio earpiece, he could hear Commander Richards trying to coordinate with tactical teams outside. "All units, we have active gunfire inside the building. Sergeant Thompson is engaged with hostile forces directly outside the main hall. Prepare for immediate breach if civilian casualties become imminent." Marcus leaned around the pillar and saw the attacker was now only 20 meters away, moving steadily forward while maintaining fire discipline. The man's face was focused and determined. He understood his mission was to reach the hostages regardless of opposition. Taking careful aim with his hunting rifle, Marcus fired a single shot that struck the attacker in the shoulder, spinning him around and causing him to drop his assault rifle. But the man didn't go down. Instead, he reached for one of the grenades on his bandolier while stumbling backward toward the main hall entrance. "Grenade," Marcus shouted into his radio, knowing that Commander Richards needed to understand the immediate threat level. A single explosive device thrown into the crowded main hall would create carnage that no rescue operation could prevent. The wounded attacker pulled the pin from his grenade and prepared to throw it toward the main hall, where the sounds of terrified civilians could be heard just beyond the doorway. Marcus had no choice but to abandon his cover and charge directly at the man, hoping to intercept the explosive before it could be thrown. As Marcus sprinted down the corridor, the attacker saw him coming and made a desperate decision. Instead of throwing the grenade into the main hall, he hurled it directly at Marcus, trying to eliminate the threat that had been systematically destroying his team. Marcus dove to the floor as the grenade bounced off the wall above him. He had perhaps 3 seconds before the explosion would tear through the confined space of the corridor. Rolling behind another pillar, he pressed himself against the stone and covered his head as the device detonated with devastating force. The explosion shattered every piece of glass in the corridor and sent shockwaves through the museum's structure. Emergency lighting fixtures fell from the ceiling, display cases collapsed, and the sound was so intense that Marcus's ears rang despite his protection behind the pillar. When the dust and debris settled, Marcus looked around the pillar to assess the situation. The attacker was down, killed by his own explosive device when he had been too close to the blast radius. His assault rifle lay damaged and unusable several meters away. But Marcus could hear something that made his blood run cold, the sound of the remaining 3 attackers approaching rapidly from behind him. They had heard the explosion and were rushing to support their teammate, not knowing he was already dead. Marcus's radio crackled with an urgent message from Commander Richards. "Sergeant Thompson, respond immediately. We registered a significant explosion near the main hall. What is your status?" "Thompson here. Marcus whispered into his microphone while checking his rifle for damage from the blast. Fourth hostile eliminated, but 3 more approaching my position. Grenade threat neutralized, but hostiles still armed and dangerous. Through the smoke and debris, Marcus could see the 3 remaining attackers entering the far end of the corridor. They moved more cautiously now, having lost half their team to a single defender they had underestimated. Their leader with the scarred face was directing the other 2 to flank positions while he advanced down the center. Marcus realized he was trapped between the attackers and the main hall full of hostages. He couldn't retreat without exposing the civilians to direct attack. But he also couldn't advance against 3 well-armed opponents in an open corridor without cover. But then he noticed something that changed his tactical assessment completely. The explosion had damaged the museum's structural supports near the main hall entrance, causing part of the ceiling to sag dangerously. Heavy beams and lighting fixtures were hanging by damaged cables, creating an unstable barrier between his position and the approaching attackers. If Marcus could bring down that damaged section of ceiling, it would block the corridor and prevent the attackers from reaching the hostages. The trapped civilians would be safe behind the debris barrier. While police tactical teams found another way to enter the building, Marcus aimed his rifle at the main support cable holding up the damaged ceiling section. It was a difficult shot through smoke and debris with moving targets nearby, but it was the only way to protect the people in the main hall. He steadied his breathing, controlled his heartbeat, and squeezed the trigger with the same precision that had made him one of the best marksmen in his regiment. The bullet severed the cable cleanly, and tons of concrete, steel, and debris crashed down into the corridor with a thunderous roar. The 3 attackers disappeared behind the massive pile of rubble that now blocked the corridor completely. Marcus could hear them shouting to each other, but their voices were muffled and distant. They were trapped on the other side of the barrier, unable to reach the hostages but also unable to escape. Marcus's radio came alive with updates from Commander Richards. "Outstanding work, Sergeant Thompson. Thermal imaging shows the remaining hostiles are isolated from the civilian population. Tactical teams are moving to secondary breach points to neutralize the remaining threats." But Marcus wasn't finished yet. Through a gap in the debris, he could see one of the attackers attempting to climb over the barrier. The man was wounded but still armed, and he seemed determined to complete his mission regardless of the obstacles. Marcus took aim through the gap and fired his final shot. The shot found its target and the climbing attacker fell back behind the debris barrier. Marcus could hear the remaining 2 men shouting frantically to each other, their voices filled with desperation as they realized their mission had failed completely. They were trapped, isolated from their objective, and facing imminent capture by police tactical teams. Within minutes, the sound of breaching charges echoed through the museum as specialized units entered through multiple access points. Professional voices called out tactical positions and confirmed areas were secure. The systematic clearing of the building had begun, and it was only a matter of time before the remaining attackers were neutralized. Marcus set down his rifle and activated his radio one final time. "Commander Richards, this is Sergeant Thompson. Corridor to main hall is secure and blocked. All immediate threats to civilian population have been eliminated. Remaining hostiles are trapped and isolated for your tactical teams." "Excellent work, Sergeant," came the reply.
"Medical teams are standing by."
"Are you injured?" Marcus assessed himself quickly, noting minor cuts from flying debris and ringing in his ears from the explosion, but nothing serious. "Negative, Commander. Minor injuries only. Ready to assist with hostage evacuation when you give the order." As police tactical teams secured the remaining attackers, Marcus made his way to the main hall where museum staff were beginning to organize the evacuation of traumatized civilians. Emergency lighting had been restored and medical personnel were entering to treat anyone who needed assistance. The scene in the main hall was one of controlled chaos. 400 people who had thought they were going to die were now processing the reality that they were safe. Some wept with relief, others sat in stunned silence, and many were asking questions about what had happened and who had saved them. Museum Director Elizabeth Hayes approached Marcus with tears in her eyes. "Are you the one who stopped them? The police said a single man prevented the attackers from reaching us." Marcus nodded quietly, uncomfortable with the attention. "Just doing what needed to be done, ma'am. The important thing is that everyone is safe." As the evacuation proceeded, Marcus found himself face to face with Charles Pemberton III and his group of friends. They were among the last to leave, still shaken by their brush with death. Charles looked confused when he saw Marcus. Something about the quiet civilian seemed familiar, but he couldn't place where they had met. "Excuse me," Charles said hesitantly, his earlier arrogance completely gone. "Were you the one who fought those men?" "The police said someone inside stopped the attack." Marcus looked at the man who had mocked him just days earlier, calling him weak and questioning whether he could even use a rifle properly. The irony was almost overwhelming. "I helped where I could," Marcus replied simply. Charles studied his face more carefully, recognition dawning slowly. "Wait, I know you from somewhere. Have we met before?" Marcus could have revealed the truth then, could have explained that the ceremonial soldier Charles had ridiculed at Buckingham Palace had just saved his life, and the lives of hundreds of others. But that wasn't who Marcus was. He had never served for recognition or gratitude. He served because it was right. "I don't think so," Marcus said quietly, turning to help an elderly woman who was struggling to walk toward the exit. As Charles and his friends were escorted out by police, Marcus heard one of them talking to a news reporter who had gained access to the scene. "We thought we were all going to die," the man said into the camera, "but someone inside fought them off. A real hero. We don't even know who he was." Commander Richards found Marcus as the last of the civilians were being evacuated. "Sergeant Thompson, I need you to know that what you did here today was extraordinary. Single-handedly neutralizing 4 heavily armed attackers and protecting 400 civilians. There will be recognition for this." Marcus shook his head. "That's not necessary, sir. I was just in the right place at the right time. No, Sergeant. You were the right man in a terrible situation. Your actions today proved that training, courage, and dedication can overcome impossible odds." Over the following weeks, news of the museum attack dominated headlines across Britain. The story of how a lone defender had prevented a massacre captured the public imagination. Security footage from the museum showed glimpses of Marcus's actions, but his face was never clearly visible, and he had insisted on remaining anonymous in all official reports. The media dubbed him the guardian of the museum, speculating about his identity and background. Military experts analyzed the tactical precision of his actions, noting that only someone with extensive combat training could have succeeded against such overwhelming odds. Charles Pemberton III gave several interviews about his experience during the attack, describing how terrified he had been and how grateful he was to the mysterious defender who had saved everyone. In one interview, he admitted that the experience had changed his perspective on military service and those who dedicate their lives to protecting others. "I used to think soldiers were just playing dress-up," Charles told a BBC reporter. "But after what happened at the museum, I understand that real courage and skill aren't always visible on the surface. Sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who look the most ordinary." Marcus watched the interview from his barracks at Wellington Barracks, preparing for another day of ceremonial duty at Buckingham Palace. In a few hours he would put on his red uniform, shoulder his rifle, and stand motionless outside the palace gates while tourists took photographs and made comments about the toy soldiers who guarded the Queen. Some would mock him, as they always did. They would question his courage, his training, and his dedication. They would assume that because he remained silent and motionless, he was weak or useless. But Marcus would stand there with quiet dignity, knowing that beneath the ceremonial uniform was a man who had proven himself when it mattered most. He had faced impossible odds to protect innocent lives, and he had succeeded not because of recognition or reward, but because it was his duty. The quiet royal guard had nothing left to prove to anyone. His actions had spoken louder than any words ever could. As Marcus finished polishing his boots and preparing his equipment for another day of silent service, he reflected on the strange turns life could take. 3 days ago, he had been mocked and dismissed as a ceremonial decoration. Today, he was being praised as a hero by the same people who had questioned his worth. But both the mockery and the praise missed the point entirely. Marcus hadn't saved those people to prove anything to Charles Pemberton or anyone else. He had saved them because when innocent lives were threatened, standing idle wasn't an option. Whether he was wearing a red ceremonial uniform or civilian clothes, whether he was standing motionless at palace gates or moving through a darkened museum with a rifle, Marcus Thompson was exactly what he had always been, a soldier dedicated to protecting others, regardless of whether anyone noticed or cared. The quiet royal guard shouldered his rifle and walked toward another day of silent service, carrying with him the knowledge that when the moment of truth had come, he had been ready.